Good afternoon. I am Michael Kessler, Managing Director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a professor in the Department of Government. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today for what promises to be a vital discussion about the moral nature of humanitarian intervention. This event is sponsored by the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and the Catholic Studies Program. Moderating the panel this afternoon is my colleague John Carr, who is the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. John serves as Washington correspondent of America Magazine. John has rich experience serving for over 20 years as director of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he provided guidance for the U.S. bishops' public policy and advocacy initiatives and publicly representing the department. He also headed the Catholic Campaign for Human Development and has contributed to the development of national statements such as Communities of Salt and Light and Faithful Citizenship. In addition, Carr has also served as executive director of the White House Conference on Families and as director of the National Committee for Full Employment. Before I turn it over to John, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones, iPhones, other noise-making devices so that everyone can hear the proceedings. And so with that, welcome, John.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to our co-sponsors, the Berkeley Center, the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and the Catholic Studies Program. Recent events have reminded us of different times: the Cold War, Ukraine and Crimea, the standoff. We thought things were going to be different, and in many ways they are. And one of the ways in which they're different is the tests of policy and the use of force is being measured in different ways in different places for different reasons. I find it striking that we're supposed to be able to follow every passenger on Earth in terms of whether they're a terrorist or not, but we seem to have lost an airplane for 2 weeks. This suggests that we're not as in charge as we think we are. But when it comes to this topic of humanitarian intervention, there are a couple things that are clear. One is there are serious questions about what to do when a government attacks and violates the basic human rights of its own citizens. Those are not new questions, but they take on new urgency. Just think of Syria today. Secondly, the Roman Catholic Church has been thinking about this for a long time. I remember when one of our bishops testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the senators asking about the use of force said, "You people have been thinking about this since the invention of gunpowder." And he wanted to know what that reflection had yielded in terms of guidance. So we think this is a timely discussion, a complicated discussion, and will be a very interesting discussion, especially given the new attention to Catholic social thought as a result of the simple ways and very strong words of Pope Francis. So let me introduce our panel. In our program, you'll find detailed descriptions of all their good work and credentials. I thought I might take a little bit different tack. My wife runs a preschool in the Methodist Church in our neighborhood, and they have a little game they play, which is which one is not like the other one. And so I have a couple questions for you about our panel, and I'll tell you something about us. Which one has not worked for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops? How many? Well, I won't ask. Drew, I hired Drew. It's one of my real claims to fame. He was a wonderful, thoughtful academic, and we turned him into a frenzied bureaucrat who provided great advice to the Bishops' Conference when he was director of the Office of International Justice and Peace. Milan Vivir served in the Domestic Policy Office under Ron Kriedemeyer and did great work on a whole range of issues of housing and poverty and employment. I was director of the modestly named Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development, and the only one who has never been on the payroll is Father David Hollenbach, although he was a consultant to the committee that wrote the pastoral letter. Try one more. How many of us have new positions at Georgetown? This is sort of the rookie league. I feel like this is a tryout. I was down at spring training. Well, Drew is a distinguished professor of ethics and global development at the School of Foreign Service and a big shot over at the Berkeley Center. Milan is the director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security and was the first ambassador for the U.S. government for global women's issues. And I came last September to start this initiative. David is here as a visiting scholar, so that means he gets to write the book that he came here to write and to be on the panels that we asked him to be on. David is a wonderful scholar from Boston College, where he is the director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Boston College, and the University Chair in Human Rights and International Justice. One more. 3 of the 4 of us are products of Jesuit education. Well, obviously, the 2 Jesuits, it seems to have taken. Father Christian got his undergraduate degree from Fordham, an STM from Woodstock Theological College, and a PhD from Yale, which, to the best of my knowledge, is not a Jesuit institution. And Father Hollenbach obtained his PhD from Yale and his BS from St. Joseph's University, and he also studied at St. Louis University. Milan received her BS and her MS from here at Georgetown University, and she's the only person I've ever met who said she actually took a book out of this library. Before coming to Georgetown, my only connection with Jesuit higher education was paying for it. And I am still paying for it. I think I said to Father David, the way the Jesuits practice the option for the poor is by making me poor. The 4 of us have been wrestling with these issues for a long time. Drew and I as advisors to the Bishops' Conference, Milan at the highest levels of the U.S. government and the State Department, David as a leading scholar, writer on human rights, and also very significantly an advisor to the Jesuit Refugee Service. David and Drew have written extensively on this. All of us have visited places that we're going to talk about today. I can remember Drew coming back with literally war stories from the Balkans, the Middle East. Milan has been everywhere there is to be, I think, is constantly on the move. And David has done wonderful work in Africa, especially, helping train people there and getting to know things there. I think all of us have been to Rwanda and wondered how that could have happened in the most Catholic country in Africa. My experience was of staffing bishops' solidarity visits to most of these places. My wife always said, you go to places where there is a war, was a war, or will be a war. And these solidarity visits are a lot like a family vacation without the fun. In that you get to see the church at work, you get to see the forces that are tearing a society apart, and you get to see both the moral and the human dimensions of these questions. So let me begin by just going straight to the title of our symposium, which is about moral factors and human consequences. So each of you, and I'll begin with Moanne, in your experience, what is the most significant moral factor in assessing the wisdom of humanitarian intervention, and what are the human consequences, the human factors, which need to be taken into account in making those decisions? And then I'll go to David and then Drew.
Well, before I address that very heavy topic, let me just say that I don't know that I've ever been on such an esteemed panel, particularly sandwiched between two Jesuits. So it's a first for me, and it's a great pleasure to be back with John, who I'm delighted is at Georgetown, because I have worked with him and admired what he has done for so long in furthering social justice in the name of the church we all care about. So thank you for that. And it is true, I date myself when I say this, this was a library when I was a student here. So it's good that we've progressed to another place. But in terms of this very important topic, it is one that I think, in fact, could be in many ways more important today, because we are seeing the constant occurrences of conflicts intra-state as opposed to one state against another, except Ukraine now hovers over that statement in a new way. But I think these are very difficult issues that we have to grapple with, and the whole conversation that we're having about humanitarian intervention, often humanitarian military intervention, is one that increasingly confronts us as actors on this earth, but certainly confronts governments. And the way that it has been heretofore defined is that we all know that the responsibility of a state is to protect its own citizens, to protect its people. But more often than not these days, we see so many occurrences of atrocities and what we'd call war crimes, genocide, mass slaughter, suffering, brutality, ethnic cleansing, the kinds of things that cry out for an intervention when that state in which it is occurring either is not responding or is perpetrating that violence. And so there have been frameworks developed to address that. So I would say in that context, the great moral dimension is, what do we do to address the crimes that are being committed? What do we do to prevent those atrocities? What do we do to save lives? And in addressing those extraordinarily significant questions, because that is the great moral challenge, the human dimension of that, of course, is also to address that very moral question, but it's also to weigh the different factors that have to be weighed. Is force, for example, the only course? Is it the course of last resort? Is it what we have to do under the circumstances? What are the consequences to the intervener, to the citizens in the state of intervention? There are so many questions that have to be factored in, and often they have to be factored in rather quickly. You know, we can talk about sequencing, we can talk about what has to come first, but often there isn't the luxury of a lot of that. But for me, the great moral question is, how in these circumstances can we intervene in the frameworks that have been adopted, whether they're just war or responsibility to protect or one and the same? How do we do that in a way that will make the beneficiaries of that intervention better off than they are before we come in?
David, build on that. The imperative is to save lives. What are the moral considerations? What are the human considerations we ought to take into account?
Well, I mean, the way I would approach this would be to ask the question, if we're going to talk about intervention, for starters, the question is, why are you intervening? What's the purpose of the intervention? There's been a lot of controversy about this topic, partly because some people think the appeal to humanitarian intervention, especially as it was being discussed back about a decade ago or so, is really a screen for a kind of desire of powerful countries to control and rule over others. That it's really a smokescreen for imperialism. That the West wants to. There's a book by a man named Mahmoud Mamdani, who's he's a Ugandan of Indian descent, but he maintains that the recently developed theory of the so-called responsibility to protect is a screen for the recolonization of Africa. He says it straight out. Miguel Descoto, who was the ambassador of Nicaragua to the United Nations General Assembly, serving as president of the General Assembly back several years ago, a former Maryknoll priest, maintained that this intervention discussion is really a kind of way of dressing up imperialism. So these are some people who say what's really going on here is powerful people trying to tell weak people what to do. It's what the French, back in the days of their colonial era, called la mission civilisatrice, the mission to civilize people. And they justified the colonization of large parts of Africa in the name of that. Well, I would say that's not what humanitarian intervention should be. But in order to make clear that it's not that, you have to define very carefully what it is and what might be legitimate. That's where I think bringing in the discussion of the so-called responsibility to protect, which evolved out of a report prepared under the auspices of the Canadian government back in 2001, and then reaffirmed by the United Nations General Assembly in 2005. The so-called responsibility to protect said there are only a very limited number of reasons why you can and should intervene. And they were basically mass atrocities. The list that Milan gave earlier, they explicitly include genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes. So it's to protect human rights, but it's not just, if you will, to protect people from what I hate to call it, but you'll see what I mean. It's not just routine violations of human rights, but it's really massive violations of human rights, like genocide or like ethnic cleansing. So Mr. Putin appealed to the responsibility to protect when Russia sent troops into Georgia. But those crimes were not being committed there, and therefore I think he was wrong in appealing to the responsibility to protect there, just as he would be wrong to say he's going to intervene in Ukraine to protect Russians. Under this doctrine of legitimate humanitarian intervention, those kinds of massive crimes are obviously not taking place in Ukraine. So the big moral issue that I would put forward as the starting point, it's not the only one, but it's the starting point, would be why are you intervening, and making a distinction between legitimate grounds for intervention and illegitimate grounds for intervention.
Drew, if it's not neo-colonialism and if it's strictly the responsibility to protect under the most gross kinds of attacks, how do we judge that? What are the criteria? What are the moral frameworks under which we can assess those decisions?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that there's an old term for this, which was called humanitarian rescue. And I think the notion of having to rescue someone in harm's way is at the root of what's going on here. Intervention, in a way, is a secondary concept and a secondary set of problems that need to be resolved before you can move ahead. But when Dave and I studied at Yale, we studied with a man named Chuck Powers, who'd worked on social responsibility. And he developed something called the Kew Gardens principle, about responsibility to take action on social questions when those responsible weren't doing it. And the Kew Gardens principle took its name from the Kitty Genovese case in Queens, where a woman was repeatedly attacked in her apartment in the view of other people. It's summertime, they could see through the windows, hear the cries, people down on the street could hear and so on. And no one out of 30-odd people who were aware of it responded. And the principle was that if you had knowledge, if you were close to the situation, if you had capability to respond in some way, and those responsible, say the police department, didn't respond, then you had an obligation to respond, to find some way to do that. And it seems to me that those kinds of things need to be reviewed in all these situations. You know, ordinarily we think of the obligation being created by the situation of mass atrocities, but the question is, can anything be done about it? Do you have the capacity to do anything? I think the other thing that kind of constrains our thinking about this is we ordinarily think of humanitarian intervention as military intervention, military humanitarianism. Well, both the responsibility to protect and the teaching of the church on these matters thinks of humanitarian intervention as a broad spectrum of activities. Huh? The responsibility to protect, for instance, presumes that, as Catholic social teaching, beginning with Parchment that all political authorities have responsibility to uphold rights and defend them. And that the function of any political authority, a government, is to protect its own people. Now, if it fails to do that, then the question is, am I aware of it? It's the knowledge question. Am I near enough to take some action? These days, that's less of a question, I suppose. And do I have the capability? And capability is a real hard question here, but it's part of the obligation question. That is, are you able to, do you have the resources to resolve the situation? And as I said, in both lines of thinking, Catholic thinking on humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect, there's a range of things. The responsibility to protect envisages that first you have the responsibility of the state, but secondly, when you intervene, the first kinds of intervention are prevention of expansion of the problem. You can go in with anti-incitement preparation to keep people from whipping up, as Catholic Relief Services did in Israel and Palestine, from whipping up enmity between groups. You can do what they did in Kenya after the elections that had killed 1,000, or after which 1,000 people were killed, and send in people to create reconciliation between hostile groups. So there's lots of things you can do beforehand to prevent things from getting worse. We have to have military intervention. So it's very important to keep in mind, and the UN put emphasis on that second leg of the responsibility to protect. That's the way it's formulated. To try to do the most you can there. And then military intervention is the last one. And there I think the question of obligation does come down to a serious just war question, which is, or the two really, they're closely allied. That is the proportionality ad bellum. That is, will you do greater damage by getting involved militarily than it's already being done? And secondly, what's the possibility of success in this situation? Can you put Humpty Dumpty back together again in such a way that you have a functioning country, unlike what we have in Iraq today? Huh? And I must endorse what David has to say about sham reasons for humanitarian intervention. One of the reasons historically that humanitarian intervention had a bad name was the Opium Wars, for instance, or the U.S., the Spanish-American War, and remember the Maine, which was all trumped up to be able to...
You don't think Grenada was...
well, Grenada, I think those who defended the invasion of Iraq by saying it was necessary to protect the Iraqi people, the same thing applies there.
Let me ask you one specific question, Drew. Yeah, between the three of you, you've covered most of the elements of the traditional just war theory. What about authority? Who decides when humanitarian intervention is justified?
You know, I really think that international law puts it with the Security Council. That's the first place it begins. If the Security Council fails, Catholic social teaching prefers a multilateral response to a unilateral response. But John Paul II was fairly clear when it came to the Balkans that if there was no response from that kind of authority, then you could have a unilateral response. But there is all this danger that if it's a unilateral, you won't meet the test of right intention, that you'll be doing it for ulterior motives, as we went into Iraq. So, there's lots of evidence now of Mr. Putin in Georgia and now in Crimea that it can be used for those purposes. And for that reason, it seems to me it's best to try to keep it at least a multilateral if you can, because the Security Council for the foreseeable future is being blocked. But in the long term, you have to work for reform of the UN structures, as Kofi Annan recommended in 2005 when he presented the idea, namely to have a stronger peacemaking office in the UN, and also to reform the Security Council so you could deal with these kinds of situations.
You know, I think that's a really important point, because the UN Security Council is the designated authority in this construct. But as Drew just said, that certainly hasn't worked in many instances, because a couple of the superpowers, or all the superpowers in the Security Council, can at any point veto that. And that's exactly what happened in Bosnia. And I was in the White House at the time when you had, you know, reports of countless atrocities and mass slaughter. And, you know, I remember just the horror around Srebrenica and the loss of life that occurred there. And we hadn't been engaged in a more serious way. There were UN peacekeepers there. Some of the European countries had contributed to that peacekeeping force. There was a fear that if something more significant happened in terms of military power, they would be harmed. And it took a long time to negotiate, as you remember, I'm sure, to negotiate how do we get to a place where we can address these horrors that are happening in a way that it was unbelievable that in the 20th century this was occurring. Elie Wiesel was pleading about, you know, the perils of indifference and what was occurring. And finally, there was no way that the Security Council was going to okay any kind of military intervention. Russia was going to use its trump card in the Balkans. And it was putting together that multilateral alliance that NATO represented, that became the justification, and then the other NATO alliance members, those specifically with peacekeepers in Bosnia, who said, you know, we've all concurred at this point that we had to do something. So we have an authority designated that is an imperfect authority, and one that doesn't really work. And I get back to, this is a very significant problem for these times, maybe one that we wouldn't expect that we'd be dealing with so much in terms of civil wars within countries, ethnic cleansing in the case of Bosnia. But it is with us, and we still don't have the best way to go at doing this in the way that you outlined, with all of the just cause arguments that have to be met in order to really justify whether it's intentions or it's your cause or the level of the force, the proportionality, or all of the things that have to be addressed when the authority is an issue.
David, I know you want to get in on this. Let me invite you to do so, but ask a related question. What are the moral implications of not intervening, of simply standing by and watching genocide happen? We've all been to Rwanda while the world was completely ineffective in stopping what we knew was going on. So there are lots of moral questions about the use of force. What's the moral implication of refusing to use force when you could save lives?
Well, I mean, I like to take notice of biblical text in that regard. I mean, we all know the commandment, thou shalt not kill. But in the book of Leviticus, there's also a commandment that says, "Thou shalt not stand idly by thy neighbor's blood." In other words, don't stand by while your neighbor is killed. Come to the assistance of those who are in danger. Protecting human life can clearly mean not killing. But when an aggressor is attacking, there could be a need to come to the assistance of that person. Now, the consequences of not doing so can be very tragic, of course. I mean, we all know the great cry after the Holocaust, "Never again." We can't let this sort of thing happen again. But sad to say, we seem determined almost to keep letting it happen. I mean, the Rwanda case was a case where I had some very powerful experiences of visiting Rwanda shortly after the genocide, and the bodies were still piled high, unburied bodies. And I have never experienced anything like that before or since, thank goodness. But I have a very strong position opposing the death penalty. But I had this gut feeling when I visited Rwanda, somebody ought to be put to death for this, when you see the bodies lying there. But it was, no, but I don't mean simply to say that that's the only appropriate, but looking at the consequences. In visiting Rwanda, I remember talking with a mother. She was grandmother by then, but she had lost numerous children and numerous grandchildren. And spending an evening just talking with her, the tragic experience of her loss was very vivid to me. I had a student who was a Rwandan student who did a doctoral degree with me up at Boston College under my direction for his dissertation. And he wrote his dissertation on the failure of the international community to protect people in Rwanda. And I think in the end it was a fine thesis, but it may well have been a mistake for him to do it because it took him a very long time to do it because of the memories that he had that made it so difficult for him to work on this project. I remember talking to one of my colleagues who was a psychologist, and she said to me, "He never should have done that." Anyone who was a psychologist could predict that he couldn't spend the next year or two writing about this and find an ability to go through with it. So what I'm saying is that the consequences of this are clearly the deaths that are involved, but also the effect on the survivors who have lost family members, who have lost others. The deep effect on them is an extraordinary effect. And so the consequences of not intervening, General Romeo Dallaire, who was in command of the United Nations peacekeeping forces in Rwanda when they were ordered not to take action, said that with another few thousand troops in Rwanda, he could have saved 500,000 lives. 500,000 lives. Well, the failure not to act meant those lives perished. And I think that's where I'm not in favor of military activity in general. I think it's last resort, it's very, very dangerous. But when you have this kind of horror taking place, taking up, if you will, a sort of police action to prevent it seems to me to be definitely called for. And the consequences are very grave, both in terms of lost life, but also the damage to people in long terms, even the survivors.
Moanne, you...
I just want to go back to this to help us understand, not to justify. I know President Clinton has been in such agony over the fact that we didn't intervene in Rwanda. He apologized the first time he went there after the horrors had been perpetrated. And this is something that he has tried to address after the fact, dealing with the pain of the past, with victims, with the AIDS crisis, in so many other ways. But at the time Rwanda was occurring, it had come right after Somalia. And I'm sure many of you remember we went into Somalia trying to ensure that food would be able to be accessed by people desperately in need while the civil war was going on, and this horrible warlord, I think his name was Adid, was perpetrating the violence he was leading. And in the process of that, an attempt to get at him, so you had a political decision intervening, put our forces in jeopardy. The rescue that was, the attack that was supposed to take place got sabotaged in a way by the local forces. We lost 18 soldiers. You all remember, if you saw Black Hawk Down, what an impact that had on people in the United States. And so there was an immediate paralysis that took over our decision-making apparatus about, well, the next time we do something like this, we better make sure that we don't have the same kinds of consequences. And at the same time, we were involved in Bosnia, and Garajdi was taking place, and what efforts were going to go on there to try to ensure that that crisis could in some way begin to be addressed. So the political, and maybe that's not the right word, but what is happening within the forces that potentially have to be the interveners plays heavily on what they will do, no matter how dreadful the set of circumstances is. And in fact, I don't think Rwanda got even the kind of attention that it may have gotten in other circumstances, particularly given the enormity of what happened there, because all of these other things were going on. And it was after the fact that I think it weighed much more heavily than trying to address it at the time. But we were so overwhelmed in those other ways.
One of the things that has struck me is how these decisions are shifting in part because of an all-volunteer military. It used to be that our Congress was made up of veterans and members who had family members who were in the military. That's almost completely gone now. My son-in-law is returned from Iraq and came into our family in a way that we hadn't anticipated. And part of what you're talking about is not only the consequences for the people there, but the people here. How do you say that you're going to send someone else's son or daughter to fight and die to solve someone else's problem? And how does that weigh? One of the things, Milan, that you have done through your whole life is you have connected policy and grassroots. And one of the things that the Catholic tradition has emphasized is force can be used when everything else fails, but you really need to invest in avoiding that failure. Mm-hmm. And so I'm struck by the fact that your initiative or institute, I need to know how you get to be an institute.
I'll talk about it later.
Is named Peacemaking before it's named Security. So much of what's needed in these places is not an army ready to march, but a community willing and able to make peace. Can you talk about that?
But before I do, I want to go back to your point about the volunteer army, because I personally believe that we would have weighed a bit more heavily our invasion of Iraq if we had, at that point, had a draft situation as opposed to a volunteer army. But that's another debate. Drew said earlier that in the construct of the responsibility to protect, intervening with military power is not the first and foremost mandate of that proposition. It in fact is responsibility to prevent and responsibility to rebuild both go hand in glove with the responsibility to intervene, however that intervention takes place. And I think the whole arena of prevention doesn't get anywhere near the attention that it deserves, that we pay attention to those early warning signs of the need to go in because something is going to happen that is going to be much worse. Now, women are often the denial of their rights, what happens to them in terms of sexual violence in particular, are frequently what happens to them is the early warning sign of so much worse about to be perpetrated in terms of the kinds of ultimate disasters we've been talking about here. And I think there are a variety of ways we have to invest in those preventive avenues that we're not approaching. One of my problems with the responsibility to protect is that while it is synergistic with what is the Security Council's commitment to linking women to peace and security, has hardly been recognized by either the Commission in 2001 or by the World Summit in 2005 that put this into play. A great deal of these atrocities that this was a response to are perpetrated against women. And in many ways, this was acknowledged in the Rome Statute in terms of rape figuring very significantly. Women are today the vast majority of the citizens who die in these conflicts. They are 70 to 80% of the displaced, internally displaced people. And you have the Security Council promulgating a resolution that has been sequentially improved in ways that others have been adopted to put specific emphasis on how this link to women, peace, and security is supposed to be made. Now, the three major areas are prevention, the role that women need to play and the way they're impacted and what needs to be done to address that. They're like the canaries in the mines. If the canaries don't come back or they're all black, you know something pretty bad is going on, and we ought to look at those warning signs. Secondly, protection. Because they are so vulnerable and have been so vulnerable, and increasingly atrocities, the massive rape campaigns that go on as a purposeful strategic tool in these conflicts has got to be more seriously addressed than it has been. And that is one of the ways that the Security Council has been putting a renewed emphasis because of pressure from the outside. And thirdly, and maybe even most importantly, what's not recognized at all is the fact that women have a critical role to play, a participatory role. We had the Secretary General of NATO here this morning, and as he put it, women aren't just the victims, they are victimized to be sure, but they are also massive assets. And these assets are not being deployed in terms of the preventive piece or even beyond that in ways that we should muster them. And we have many examples, and one of the things we're trying to do at the Institute is build that body of data and research and scholarship to show whether it was in Liberia or in Northern Ireland or in South Africa, women have played these very strategic roles, have made a difference in terms of the outcome, and need to be taken seriously. I sat in Kabul one night with a group of women in the midst of what Afghanistan represents today, and the first one who spoke said to me, "Stop looking at us as victims and start looking at us as the leaders that we are." And I was profoundly impacted by that, not because I didn't believe what she said, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought about if the only lens we have that makes us look at people, women, whether they're in the DRC or they're in Afghanistan, is this lens of their being victims, and oftentimes we don't address the problems they are confronting, but never see them as the people on the front lines of change who can be the people who can make a difference, then we're missing a very big part of what we can be doing on the prevention side. And so I hope that, given that RP2 and 1325, the Security Council resolution, are parallel but really joined, we've got to do more on the joining side. And I'll say one more thing, and that is I wasn't in my position, my last position as ambassador, but for a month when I was hauled in before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a hearing on the Democratic Republic of Congo and the conflict that's been going on probably for a decade now that has taken hundreds of thousands of lives, and where rape is the primary tool of the armed combatants. And the senators were saying to me, those who were participating in this hearing, what are we doing about the fact that the women are so vulnerable? The fact that when they go for water, as they have to do to get out of the camps, or for firewood, we know they're most vulnerable. And yet, constantly, they are in this vulnerable state, and that's not being addressed. And you know, a number of things have happened to begin to take that incident and others into consideration. And then when Secretary Clinton went to Congo and met with, and any of us who've seen, and any of you who've been in these circumstances and seen what is happening, and so many ways in which we really could be making a difference, she went on behalf of the United States to the Security Council and offered a resolution that was passed unanimously, ultimately, to ensure that there be a special representative of the Secretary General assigned to put a focus on this violence that's being perpetrated against women, sexual violence and conflict. The big point about that is what goes with it is the deployment of experts early on, when the signs are beginning to show, to begin to work out some of these conditions on the ground before they get much worse. So I just think there's a lot more we need to be doing in this space. You know, it wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would go a long way to getting us to a better place.
We're going to turn to questions in just a moment, but let me ask our panel one last question from me, at least for now. The clearest intersection between the Catholic community and the U.S. government on the right to protect was around the question of whether the U.S. ought to use ought to act in light of Syria's use of chemical weapons against its own people. And I'm sure we all recall it. It looked like that's what was going to happen, that we were going to hit Syria, either the sites or command and control centers or whatever. And Pope Francis said, again, probably surprisingly, everything he does seems to surprise, what we need is a day of prayer and fasting for peace. I'm going to be here on Saturday. Why don't you all come? And 150,000 people came and prayed. Not a lot of speeches. I've never said the rosary in Italian. I was watching it on TV. By the end, I knew it. And a couple days later, the president and his chief advisors were gathered in the Oval Office to take the final decision as to when and how to move. And the president and the chief of staff went for a walk around the driveway of the White House and came back in, and to the surprise of everybody apparently in the room, said, we're not going to do this. We need to talk to Congress. We need to talk to others. Now, these two people, Pope Francis and President Obama, are going to meet in a couple weeks. What would you put in the briefing memo for the discussion on when and how to use force to protect the innocent?
Could I, I'm not entirely, well, on that I would say last resort, but let me say a few more things about other things that could be done before you get to the last resort, not only about prevention, which Milan said so eloquently about the importance of prevention, but even about bringing conflicts that are underway, stopping them. Syria is a unique case in some ways because it's so bloody complicated. But let me give you an example of another case, which a lot of people thought was really insoluble, and that was the war that went on for 20 years between Sudan and southern Sudan before South Sudan became an independent country. Between the North and the South, there was a conflict there that went on for years and years and years. 1 million people were killed. There were 2 million refugees and internally displaced people, and so forth. George W. Bush, got heavy pressure on him from the religious community. The Catholic bishops had been very involved in Sudan for a long time. But then the evangelical and call it the Christian right got involved, partly because they thought this was a conflict where Muslims were killing Christians. And this was an issue that agitated them very much. They put heavy pressure on George Bush. The bishops had been doing it, but when the right got involved, the Christian right got involved, Bush decided he had to act. He appointed a special envoy. He got Colin Powell involved in it. The United States, together with the UK, together with Norway, became involved in a very major way. A regional group around Sudan called IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which includes Kenya and Uganda and Ethiopia and several other countries. They became very involved. A general from Kenya named General Simbewo became the mediator between the two forces on both sides. Then there were grassroots groups. The churches were working at the grassroots on peace building. There were intermediate level groups of NGOs. There were a whole series of initiatives on peace building from the top at the diplomatic level, from the grassroots with the churches, in the intermediate level with NGOs and their international org. And lo and behold, they got a peace agreement. 2005, they signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement after a bloody war that went on for years and years and years. And in effect, the leaders in Khartoum and in Rumbek, which is where the SPLM, SPLA forces, the rebels, were based, they were in effect compelled to come to an agreement by international pressure.
Yeah.
And I think if we took that kind of action on some other areas, we could make a big difference. Perhaps Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't think we could do it in Syria, because there are some serious other complicating factors in Syria. But there are ways that we can take pressure. So I would say if Obama's going to talk to the Pope, I think the Pope ought to say, why don't you do in DRC what your predecessor, George W. Bush, did in Sudan?
Yeah. Well, and to his credit, I think President Obama, Dennis McDonough, and being in the lead, kept up that pressure, and it was a combination of carrots and sticks,
right,
which led to an agreement, fragile agreement.
Actually, subsequently, it's broken down, which I don't want to get in. That's another whole story. But
how about questions from the audience? I'm sure we've solved it all. In case we haven't, there might be a question or two.
We could use some solutions.
Yeah. Over here. Please identify yourself for the rest of us who don't know.
Marie Dennis with Pax Christi International. A question about this. Thank you for those interventions. They were all very helpful, and Milan especially. I think what you brought to us was extremely important in terms of the role of women. My question is about two pieces. One being the question of who might intervene. So the assumption was a bit that the U.S. would be the intervening body, and that given approval by a multilateral body, the UN Security Council or whatever, that the U.S. would play the role. I would like to suggest that one of the pieces we have not done well in terms of preparation is to think about how a multilateral body could, in fact, be prepared to take an action that would be a police action, not a military action, that would take out of it the self-interest, would keep the use of violence to a minimum. And then the second part of that is, what obligation do we have, in fact, to design, to identify, to create non-military tools for intervening in terms of respecting those who are at great danger? It seems to me that we have, it's if everything looks like if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think we do that much too well, and that we have not invested enough creative energy or money in real alternatives that would, in fact, protect, that would equip UN peacekeeping forces with the skill and the capacity to respond. So any comments you have on that, I'd appreciate.
Okay.
Well, let me go to the second part of that question in terms of what's in our toolbox, or what do we need to put in our toolbox that we don't have. And I think that's a really important consideration, because I think we often, even what we do have, we don't often use as effectively as we might. So even though the DRC has been generally a bad news story, I think in recent months, several things that have happened that I think touch on your question. One is over in the last year, I guess, the M23 rebels, more than a year, came in. The view largely is that Kagame from Rwanda has been behind this. But regardless, they were wreaking havoc again in ways that were tremendously consequential on the people living there. And in this case, the peacekeepers were beefed up in a way that they could respond. It's the largest peacekeeping force anywhere in the world, UN peacekeeping force, but they were able to have an additional mandate, if you will, to actually push back. And I think that made a difference. But the other thing that's happening now goes more to the non-military side, and I think it's something that David was talking about as well. And that is, there's been an agreement in this Great Lakes region, because it's not just DRC, it is Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi's there. And a number of countries have agreed, but that obviously isn't everything, because we often see so many agreements are shredded in no time or abrogated in no time. But in this case, the United Nations appointed Mary Robinson to go in as the envoy of the Secretary General. The United States has appointed Senator Russ Feingold, who is deeply, has been for years, deeply interested in Africa when many of his colleagues may not have been. And other countries have created this diplomatic force. Mary came here to Georgetown, in fact, to tell us about the emphasis she's putting on the women's groups in all of those countries, and a way to beef up the empowerment that they need to be a greater presence in a positive way on the ground. And the World Bank has committed about $1 billion, put it on the table. How that money is going to be used to incentivize better behavior is yet to be determined, but that's a powerful magnet, both to support grassroots kinds of operations, diplomatic operations, but also parallel development assistance that would go a long way to solving it. So I think you're right on, which is we need more creative ways in the ways we go to address these situations.
Let me tell you a story about your first question, which is, other than the U.S., Cardinal McCarrick was chairman of the Bishops' International Policy Committee and was in the Far East and scheduled to go to East Timor. And the U.S. government advised him not to go. And usually Cardinal McCarrick ignores that advice and goes anyway. But in this case, they were quite emphatic. Drew can tell you some stories. But they were quite emphatic that he couldn't go. And it was a good thing he didn't, because the Indonesian military invaded East Timor. and in their first set of actions, killed a group of Caritas workers, Catholic Charities workers, set fire to the cathedral, hacked one of the bishops, and they were looking for Bishop Bello. And obviously, it was great concern. And Sandy Berger, the National Security Advisor, went on TV. It was not his best moment. He did much good work for our country. But he was asked, what should we do about East Timor? And he said, we can't go everywhere. He says, my daughter's dorm room in New York is a mess. Do you want me to send in the Marines? Well, that was not an appropriate response. So I think with Milan's help, Cardinal McCarrick talked to Hillary Clinton.
I was the Catholic telephone line.
Yeah. And as you can imagine, some of that duty was not fun. There were serious disagreements as well. But she said, talk to Dick Holbrooke, who was the UN advisor. And one of the things McCarrick said was, if these were synagogues being burned down, you wouldn't be talking about dorm rooms. And Dick Holbrooke said, you'd never say that publicly, would you? And McCarrick said, I would like not to. And in the space of 24 hours, I think not, US policy was turned around. I think the First Lady had enormous influence. Cardinal McCarrick, because of the work we had done on landmines, had great ties to the US military, which had the best ties to the Indonesian military. So in that case, not a single US troop was deployed. The Australians led a peacekeeping force, and the US military warned their counterparts in Indonesia that if they kept this up, there would be no more US military aid. So there are alternatives to US troops landing.
And there's a PS to this to redeem Sandy Berger in one way, and that is it was he who recommended to the president that Bishop McCarrick then get the President's Human Rights Award.
Well, other questions? In back there?
Hi, I'm Ori Saltes. I teach theology here at Georgetown. Two questions, actually. One is contemporary, and the other is more historical. The contemporary one is that yesterday, you may know this guy. His name's Elliot Abrams. He spoke here, not in this room, but at this university. And in a question about Syria, he was critical of the administration because, and I'm pretty well quoting him, what they should have done was to have given better support to non-jihadi rebels. That's his turn of phrase. I'm not going to tell you what I thought of that response. I'd be curious to yours. And the second is historical, and just to assuage my curiosity. Pope Pius XII, of course, has been both excoriated and exonerated, depending upon by whom, with respect to his response/non-response to the events of the Holocaust. And again, I'd simply like your thoughts on that matter, since it's one that comes up again and again, the old story which is always renewed. Thank you.
Well, those are two really easy to handle. Drew, you're a diplomat.
Well, it's not the first time I disagreed with Elliot Abrams. Although we work together from time to time as well. But I learned that from John. Yeah, sometimes I wondered myself too about whether we could have done more for the non-jihadis. But I think caution in this situation was probably the better part of valor. That the situation, as David has insisted over and over again, is so complicated. There's so many cross-cutting factors in the situation. It would be very hard for a military force to bring it outside of occupation for the next quarter century. And getting enough forces to do that over a sustained time, getting agreement to do it, would be exceedingly difficult. And it would be very, very costly. That was one of the worries about the chemical weapons. I think that military intervention, outright military intervention in Syria wouldn't have made the test of probability of success. And so I wouldn't have gone in. That's very much a prudential judgment, but I think it weighs very heavily in that direction. And the people who decided with caution did the right thing. I think there are lots of things that could be done. A lot more could be done about refugees. The Senate, the Congress has always been reluctant to let in more Arab refugees, but especially, with the Christian refugees, it's their last resort. And I think it's something we ought to keep pushing. I think at the time of the Israeli-Hezbollah war in 2006, Pope Benedict had the best diplomatic program and included, in addition to safe harbor for refugees, humanitarian assistance and humanitarian corridors. And I think the effort that was put into dealing with the chemical weapons question, which I think was a legal quibble and a sop for bad conscience myself, I think should have been put into humanitarian corridors and humanitarian aid and refugee assistance.
Interesting.
David, you've done considerable work on refugees. I think your new book is on refugees.
Well, what I would like to say is, I agree with Drew. I think the internal struggles internal to Syria are such that a heavy move by an outside force at this point, like the United States, is likely to make things worse. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what Drew said about the refugee situation is really very, very important. The refugee crisis related to the Syria situation is the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. There are now almost 9 million displaced people driven from their homes in Syria. That's 40% of the population of Syria has been driven from its homes. Most of them are internally displaced, but there are over 1 million of them have crossed over into Lebanon. There are 1 out of every 4 people living inside the boundaries of the country of Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. Now, the danger there is not only that these Syrian refugees in Lebanon are not being provided for. Lebanon is not a notoriously stable country. There are all sorts of tensions inside of Lebanon between Sunnis and Shia and Druze and other internal political. And the danger is that this whole conflict in Syria can go regional. There are tensions across the border in Turkey. And part of that tension issue is the refugee problem. And I heard the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, a couple of us in the audience were both there last week down at the U.S. Institute of Peace, Antonio Guterres. And he said he thought that the international community had lost the ability to deal with the internal problems of Syria, but that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees only had half the money it needed to deal with the refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and other places around. So I think if we're going to try to respond to that, I would reinforce what Drew said, finding ways to deal with these refugees in a way that one of the best places to generate really angry people who want to take military actions is in a refugee camp. That's where Hezbollah came from, that's where Hamas came from, and a number of other groups. So I think to take steps to deal with those problems is really crucial to the overall peacemaking effort, not only to responding to the needs of the people there.
Any brief response to the second question?
No, but can I add on to the refugee issue, because
Okay.
it is a problem that needs far more emphasis than it's getting. And if you spend any amount of time with Syrians, most of whom are now on the border, in the camps, a few have left the region and are being advocates, but the situation is dire. And you can talk to any Jordanian, for example, who will tell you that the situation within their country is becoming dire as a result. So it's not, the refugee situation is really one that screams out for greater generosity and amelioration. But what pressures it's putting on these countries, particularly Jordan and Lebanon, should not be underestimated. And I agree with you completely. That is a region that's so fragile. that anything can disrupt it. And when you think of these numbers of people, the Jordanians were telling me, for example, as they're trying to school the children in some of these camps, they have now instituted 3 time cycles within a school day. So they're educating here, and then another, and then another. And that's putting a tremendous burden, that alone. But it's often within the refugee situation where you can begin to give people a new life, where you can begin to help them adjust to what they're confronting, to give them the possibilities of building their capacity, and hopefully, pray God, a chance that they're going to be better, in better shape when they go back home. It's often where those investments, talk about prevention, for a lot of reasons, have the greatest payoff when they do get to return. So I think we need to be being more creative about what we do in terms of the refugee situation, because we only think about it in terms of large numbers of people with great need, and we need more money. And that is one small part of a much bigger, much bigger challenge with a lot of possibilities in terms of what these people need, and also protection. In a lot of these camps, women especially are as vulnerable as they've ever been. So they get out of a situation of desperation where they've had to leave their country and be pushed in, and then in the camps, they're in equally desperate situation because they're so vulnerable to whatever's happening in the camp.
Brief comment
Drew, a
on
quick
Pius.
comment, and then we'll go to Dr. Ancioni.
Brief comment on Pius XII. I think if you have the patience to wait out the year, I believe the last of the Vatican archives related to his actions in World War II will be published, or released at least, and investigators will be able to comb through it to see what they could find. My own sense is that given his upbringing as a diplomat, he did as much as any world leader at that period, for one. And much that we don't take account of. Massimo Fagioli, the Italian church historian, says that when Angelo Roncalli, later John XXIII, was nuncio in Bulgaria and Turkey, where he provided a lot of protection to Jewish refugees, the Secretary of State left him on his own. They never responded. They would never even give him a no when he'd have queries. He really was on his own. But the one person he was in contact with was Pius XII. Pius XII turned out to be his protector within the Curia. And so the actions he was taking there on behalf of the Jews, I'm sure, had Pius's approbation.
Over here.
Well, first, thank you. I find discussion very illuminating. Some of us have been struggling with this question for a long time, and they're not easy ones. One footnote and a quick question. A mentioning was made of giving credit to the High Commission of Canada for the concept of the R2P. Before them, several years before, Sudanese diplomat Maneon Deng wrote a book, Sovereignty as a Responsibility, in which he laid out an excellent brief for the idea that if a country, if a government does not protect its people, it fortified its sovereignty and therefore legitimates intervention. So he made sovereignty conditional on being a good international citizen. And that's a major normative step forward. My question follows on this question, where we draw the line. And I wonder if the panel would agree that we should not use the armed humanitarian intervention to force democracy. The reason I'm raising that is, and I'm quickly summarize what happened in Libya to illustrate my question. As the rebels were proceeding from the east to the west, and they were increasingly successful, Gaddafi asked for a ceasefire, and he wanted to negotiate a settlement and transition to some kind of a coalition government. If he meant it or not, it could have been enforced by continuing the hostilities if he didn't live up to the agreement. At that point, France and Britain and then finally the United States said, no, you must go, and your regime must go, and we continue the fighting, and we have the current anarchy. The same thing in Syria, we're saying now, we want him to go. Now, it's very difficult to negotiate a peace deal with somebody. You say a condition of the peace deal that you have to leave and your regime has to go. So I wonder if you should separate, decouple armed intervention with purpose to stop genocide from the higher but more difficult charge of building a democracy in countries which are often not ready for it.
Well, those issues are, that's a very complex set of issues there. It really points to the question of this process is a process that you don't just intervene, change the situation, and then it's all fixed. There's a long-term process that I think demands all kinds of political insight into what's feasible. That has to do with what can be done before an intervention takes place, as well as what can be done after an intervention takes place. I don't want to get into it. We could get into a detailed discussion of Libya and what could have been done differently there. I'm not entirely sure that would be the most fruitful avenue to go, but I do think what you have to do is to look at not only if you're going to say we can take steps to alleviate the crisis before a military action takes place, you also need to talk about what would happen after a military action takes place. There's a lot of discussion among people in ethics these days about what's called now jus post bellum. The criteria of just war are usually called jus ad bellum, justice going into war, jus in bello, justice within war. But then what about justice after war or after conflict? And that has to do with how do you put a society back together again. And those things need to be paid much more attention to than we generally do. We have such a short attention span, it seems to me, in our politics that we've got to get over that. But
yeah, I think with respect to Professor Ezione's question, I think it relates to what the tradition called the right intention, and the right intention was to bring peace, and it was, in a sense, it was a very conservative principle in that it meant you bring it back to the status quo ante, not to the persecution, but what existed before the persecution. And I think that the responsibility to protect complicates that issue, but I think as a cautionary principle, the notion that you don't demand the change of the government immediately as a condition of negotiation is a wise one.
I just want to say that I was in government at the time that the Libya action took place. I have spent more hours than I can count meeting particularly with women in Libya who were on the front lines and very much engaged in that effort. I don't think they see it so much as an aggressive action taken to promote democracy or to push democracy as they did in that moment of ultimate possibility of greater slaughter that they were going to experience, and that establishing the no-fly zone and then the strikes got them through it. Now, the situation today is not one that, is one where we can all breathe that Libya is over the worst hurdles and true peace and a better life is going to flourish for everybody. They've got a lot of problems there. But at the time that was happening, it was a very tough time in terms of what people were experiencing. So I'm not so sure that I certainly don't second guess what was done to save a lot of lives that could have potentially been harmed there, and were in desperate shape.
I'd love to comment, but let's go over here. Don.
Don Rogers with Catholic Relief Services. And I just wanted to add to what you were saying about what are the factors for building peace. And I wanted to ask your question, but also add my own voice to the role of Episcopal conferences, sometimes regional Episcopal conferences, that over time, now as they've become indigenized, have a greater capacity, I think, to add, especially working jointly with one another, to have an authority within their own nations and then to build peace within their nation and with other states. And I just wanted to know if anyone had seen that taking place, or had any thoughts about that as a possible positive move towards peace building.
Drew can add to this. There is a principle that's never been written down in terms of the actions of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in that in every case you consult with the local conference before you take a position. In some cases, the conferences are under great pressure and even threat, so you have to be very careful about how you do it. But one of the things that struck me, Milan's point about who gets heard in these discussions. Is it the top who sort of debate this, or is it the people most affected? And here is one thing that I think we can learn from Pope Francis, in that he looks at the world from the bottom up. And that's true of economic life. It looks like it might be true of ecclesial life. It also should be true in terms of questions of war and peace. Who pays the price? Whose lives are at stake? Who fights the battles? And how are their voices heard in these discussions while the rest of us debate grand principles and geopolitics and whatever? The women in Libya who thought their lives and their families were completely at risk are probably a more trustworthy place to hear than the theoreticians, although we need a mix of both.
But to your point, and I think it's a good one, I reached out, and CRS was very helpful to me on the DRC question at the time, bringing in some of the people on the ground that you were working with. But also, it was very clear, you go to the DRC, as poor as that place is, and there's no excuse except lousy leadership for the shape that they're in, because they have tremendous resources that, of course, are also cause for so much of the grief. But the power of the church is everywhere obvious. And on a Sunday in Bukavu, in this hell zone, their people are, in whatever finery they have that can be described as finery, going off to services. And I met with several of the bishops and pleaded with them to come together as a more united force. And I think some statements came out of the bishops' conference there. But there's got to be a way to do more than make the pronouncement. And that's what I think David was actually talking about when he was talking about the Sudan. You know, really merging these.
Division among the bishops can be a problem. John will remember this. John was looking for years, because he had so much pressure from below, to get involved in Northern Ireland. The Irish caucus was really after him, that we weren't involved in Northern Ireland. And one of the bishops famously said to him, "John, you don't understand, the 34 bishops and 34 shades of green." And we finally be able to act in Northern Ireland when Cathal Daly became the primate and president of the conference, and he said, you deal with me, you deal with the conference. But when bishops as conciliators have been able to be effective, it's because they have the conference with them. One of the most effective groups was the bishops of Guatemala, for whom Juan Herrera eventually paid the ultimate price, being assassinated. But nonetheless, Cardinal Casada Toruño was the national conciliator there, but he had all the bishops with him, and that made a really big difference. In the Holy Land, you know, the Latin Patriarch was one among many, but he exercised real leadership and made sure he brought along the Orthodox and the Armenians and the other heads of churches with him to produce statements on that situation. In the Balkans, there was a breakdown, but the bishops' conference worked. But you had some heroes like the Bishop of Banja Luka, Bishop Komarica. I remember one time in the, I guess it was the '96 election year, we brought him here, and we brought him around to see members of Congress and so on. And he was due to go to Canada, and they said, no, you got to get him back here to talk to more members of Congress, because the Republicans were about to make intervention in Bosnia a major issue. Well, Komarica, and he's a real hero. I mean, he was a hero to all sorts of people. He came back and talked in his usual forceful, dramatic way to any number of senators and congressmen, and the Republicans under Senator Dole, who I can't commend enough for the good things he did in his time, kept it from becoming an issue within their party at that time and preventing the president from getting involved.
We are running out of time, and we had a couple hands up. Why don't we take these two hands and one over there, and we'll take our choice, which, if any, we want to answer.
Thank you very much. My name is James. I'm the founder of China Reporter Foundation. We talk about war and peace and human crisis in Syria and Sudan and Congo, but there's, at the same time, there's a quiet, ongoing crime against humanity in China, inside China, which is that literally not much attention in the main media. But let me quote New York Times report, and they quote the latest data from the Chinese Ministry of Health, saying 336 million abortions, 222 million sterilization since 1971 in China. So this is just crime against humanity. That means millions of lives were slaughtered. What do you think that the world community could respond to help those victims of, the women who are just has no place to escape? Not like Syria women can escape to Jordan, for example, and these women have no place to stay, and they're just brought to clinics for abortion.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
One here, and then we'll respond. There was one there.
Hi, Eli McCarthy. I teach Justice and Peace Studies here at Georgetown. So thank you for the presentation. My question is about the peacemaking imagination, if you will, and it's kind of two parts. One is there's a growing energy around the practice of unarmed civilian peacekeeping, and particularly the nonviolent peace force. And in Sudan, they have a lot of women who are actually peacekeepers, and they've been helping or walking with women when they go to get firewood or water to offer protective presence. So I'm wondering why we don't hear more about that kind of practice in this debate of R2P, particularly from Catholic leaders. I guess it seems like it's a growing edge where we could really scale that up in educating and supporting that kind of practice. And it's also obviously much more consistent with Jesus' call to love our enemies and all the good things that he says.
Okay.
But just addendum to that, Marianne Cusimano-Love, who teaches at Catholic U, she's been writing about this just peace criteria as sort of an alternative to just war criteria that apply at all stages of conflict. So if you're able to, I'd like to hear if you have any comments about her work and the possibilities of that.
Over here, there was one. I think he might have disappeared. Who wants to take a stab at those?
Well, I'll talk about the forced abortions in China. It's a huge problem. We're almost at the 20th anniversary of the UN Fourth World Conference on Women, and when we were preparing for that, and it was controversial to go because there were people on all sides of whether the United States should participate in China, but at the time, Hillary Clinton was First Lady and made a very strong statement. What people remember is human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. But what she did before she made that statement was go through a litany of the kinds of horrors that are being perpetrated around the world on women and girls, and punctuated each one by saying, this is a violation of human rights. And one of them was what's happening in terms of forced abortions. And because of the one-child policy in China, and because girls in many countries, or at least some significant countries, are not valued as much as boys, and you have no other choice, it's the girl's life that is curtailed. But this is a very serious issue, and I don't disagree with your raising it.
If I go ahead, Drew, and then I'll wrap up.
Let me respond to Eli by saying I think one of the problems of moving that imaginative step is that the church has not made clear that it has a teaching on nonviolence. It does have a teaching on nonviolence, but it's rather hidden. And the clergy are not taught in the seminaries that it has a teaching on nonviolence. So as Gerald Schlabach has said, what we need is to make the teaching on nonviolence as the first Christian reaction to conflict, and just war is only a very last resort. We need to make that teaching on nonviolence church-wide and parish deep. And that's a long revolution, and it begins in the seminaries to some extent. I think Gerald has also proposed, and I think this is very important, that we really replace the just war with the doctrine of just policing, and that we really understand that aside from outright aggression, the primary use of force is policing, and it be done under police terms. That's one of the conditions of the just peace. But to get into just peace, you get into all sorts of categories like you do in the just war, so there's no time to go into that. But making it a policing action as opposed to a war action where there's much more accountability and transparency is very important.
David?
Just one very brief comment, and that would be that one of the things about just peace that I think is crucial is that word just, namely that the peace building has to grow out of an establishment of a just society, and finding ways in which those kinds of the way in which women are treated in a place like DRC or other parts of the world where women, this is a profound injustice, and the kind of divisions that one finds in southern Sudan now, South Sudan, between different factions there are all kinds of strange economic dimensions to this that need to be dealt with in terms of establishing a more just relationship between people there. And different ways in which different ethnic groups can participate in the leadership of the country in South Sudan is a very crucial dimension. So when we talk about just peace, I'm all for the peace part of it, but I also think what we're really talking about is justice and peace together in a society like that, and we need to make sure that we get if you will, a justice imagination as well as a peace imagination going in those societies as well.
Well, we have three imaginative persons here, peace and justice. My comment on your point, we began with what is the moral question, and the answer across the board was saving lives. And so the point about the children destroyed in China because of its policies is totally appropriate and has to be dealt with. This is a state-sanctioned destruction of unborn human life in massive amounts. And my own view is that this is one of the few areas where there's some consensus in an otherwise difficult area where the church stands strongly for the defense of all human life, and others join us. My own experience on the peacemaking side is, frankly, there's more discussion, more organized discussion of peacemaking these days than a panel like this about the permissible uses of force. The Catholic Peacemaking Network, which Drew is a part of, I don't know if David is, but Notre Dame, Catholic U with Marianne Cusimano-Love, the Bishops' Conference, CRS, has been doing conferences in this country and around the world. Well, my first visit and only visit to Burundi was to talk about peacemaking in Africa. So I think there are stirrings of that peacemaking imagination, and there's a recovery of where we are. I want to thank our panel for a bunch of rookies. I thought we did okay.